At dawn on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea lay quiet under a pale sky strewn with clouds. The air was calm, the kind of morning that made sailors believe the ocean itself was at peace. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, watching 8 destroyers escort 8 fully loaded transport ships through the waters off northern New Guinea. The convoy carried the 51st Division's 6,900 soldiers, promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, at Lai to Kimura. This was not just another mission, it was the pulse of Japan's empire, a line of lifeblood stretching across the Pacific. For over a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled these waters. Convoys moved under the cover of experienced destroyers, anti-aircraft crews trained to perfection, and air cover from Rabaul. There had been close calls, but no real disasters. The officers on Kimura's bridge had seen American bombers before high-altitude B-17s that dropped their payloads harmlessly into the sea torpedo planes that came in low and slow, easy prey for concentrated fire. Doctrine had proven reliable, and experience had taught them confidence. "The Americans are clumsy," one gunnery officer muttered. "They attack from where we expect them to." Kimura nodded in quiet agreement. His convoy moved in textbook formation destroyers in a protective ring transport steady in the middle, each maintaining exact spacing and speed. It was a portrait of discipline, precision, and faith in the Imperial Navy's methods. Below decks, the soldiers of the 51st Division shared that same belief. They were young men from Osaka, Sapporo, and Kyoto, many barely 20. Some were singing softly, others writing quick notes home. The air smelled of diesel fuel and tobacco. In the mess, one soldier laughed as he tried to balance a cup of tea on the swaying table. To them, this voyage was a brief passage before the real fight on the jungled hills of New Guinea. They trusted their officers, their navy, and their empire. None could imagine that the sea around them would soon become a furnace. At 06,000 hours, Kimura studied the horizon through his binoculars. The sun was climbing, and the ocean glowed gold. 8 transports followed in perfect line their wakes, tracing white ribbons across the water. The destroyers flanked them like loyal wolves guarding the herd. The admiral took pride in that sight order discipline and purpose. He had no reason to think this mission would end differently from the dozens before it. Intelligence had warned of American reconnaissance aircraft in the area, but the reports were vague. Japanese doctrine dismissed such threats as manageable. After all, the Americans had shown little ability to stop supply convoys. The Navy's umbrella of steel had worked again and again. Yet beneath that calm surface, fate was moving. Hundreds of miles to the south on dusty airstrips in Australia, American and Australian crews were loading bombs and ammunition into modified B-25 Mitchell bombers machines, unlike anything Kimura's men had ever faced. In a few hours, those bombers would rise into the sky, cross the coastline, and bring with them a new kind of warfare. One born not in strategy meetings, but in the minds of field mechanics and desperate innovators. For now, though, the Japanese sailors believed in routine. Anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons, cleaned lenses, and loaded magazines. Signalmen scanned the skies. Officers reviewed formation charts, confident that their training could handle anything. It was an illusion of control, a brief calm before history changed its rules. The radio on Shirayuki's bridge crackled with reports of light cloud cover, good visibility, and no enemy contacts. Kimura folded his hands behind his back and allowed himself a small smile. His convoy was on schedule. The Imperial Navy had done this many times. What he could not know, what no Japanese officer could possibly imagine, was that innovation and industrial power were about to rewrite the laws of naval warfare. The American bombers that would soon appear were not ordinary aircraft. They carried no torpedoes, no delicate bomb sights, no hesitation. They had been transformed into flying gunships, weapons of precision and raw mechanical fury. By the time Kimura's lookout spotted them, it would already be too late. The calm of the Bismarck Sea would shatter, and within 15 minutes the convoy that had seemed so orderly, so invincible, would become a floating graveyard of fire and oil. If you believe Admiral Kimura was right to trust his experience, type 1 in the comments. If you think he was already doomed by his own confidence, hit like. And remember to subscribe for more true stories from the hidden battles of World War II. While Admiral Kimura's convoy moved confidently through the Bismarck Sea, the true storm was being prepared hundreds of miles to the south in the choking heat of an Australian workshop. The place was Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, a cluster of tin-roofed hangars, red dust, and the smell of hot oil. It was here, far from any design bureau or factory line, that a restless American officer named Major Paul Irvin Poppy Gunn was about to change the nature of aerial warfare. Gunn was not a conventional man. He had been a Navy pilot before joining the Army Air Forces, a mechanic before he was a commander, and a problem solver before anyone gave him permission to be one. The Pacific War had taught him a brutal truth. High-altitude bombing against ships simply did not work. Bombs missed as torpedoes malfunctioned, and too many pilots died trying to hit moving targets from thousands of feet above the sea. Every convoy that slipped through meant more American soldiers killed on the beaches of New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. His answer was radical. If high-altitude bombs could not hit ships, then the bombers themselves would have to become the weapons. He began with the North American B-25 Mitchell, a sturdy twin-engine medium bomber that was never designed for ship attacks. Gunn rolled one into his hangar, stripped the paint off its nose, and ordered his crew to tear out everything inside the bombardier's seat. The Norden bomb sight, the glass panels, the wiring, everything that didn't contribute to firepower. "We're not aiming from 10,000 FT anymore," he said, pacing in the dust cigarette hanging from his lip. "We're aiming down the barrel." His mechanics hesitated. They had no blueprints, no manuals, and no authorization from higher command. But Gunn's conviction was contagious. He and his team began welding steel plates into the nose, reinforcing the frame to absorb recoil. Then, they mounted two Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. 2 guns became 4. 4 became 6. By the time they were finished, 8 long barrels protruded from the B-25's nose like the fangs of a metallic beast. Each gun required its own ammunition feed and charging mechanism. The team scavenged belts from wrecked aircraft modified feed chutes and built boxes that could hold 400 rounds per gun. The wiring had to be rerouted through the cockpit, allowing the pilot to fire all 8 guns with a single trigger. The added weight over 500 lb of steel and ammunition shifted the aircraft's balance forward. Gunn recalculated the trim himself, adjusting counterweights and fuel distribution until the plane flew level again. When he was done, the bomber looked less like a precision instrument and more like an airborne chainsaw. The test flight came at dawn. The modified B-25 taxied out onto the red dirt runway, its engines coughing thick smoke into the air. Gunn climbed into the cockpit wearing grease-stained coveralls instead of a flight suit. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, crew covered their ears. At 500 FT above the practice range, Gunn leveled out and pressed the trigger. The nose erupted in light and sound. 8 streams of fire converging into a single roar. The vibration shook the entire airframe, the recoil thrumming through the fuselage like a living pulse. Spent shells cascaded from the sides, bouncing off the wings like brass rain. When he landed, the grin on his face said everything. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said. "She eats ships." Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots who saw the demonstration could not believe what they had witnessed. One observer compared it to a destroyer turned sideways and given wings. Another said simply, "That's not a bomber, it's a buzzsaw." Within weeks, field modification teams across Australia began copying Gunn's design. Reinforcement plates were welded in place, ammunition storage expanded, and electrical firing circuits standardized. The Americans had created something completely new, a medium bomber reborn as a gunship. The firepower was staggering. 850 caliber machine guns firing together unleashed 6,800 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly an ounce and traveled at 2,910 FT per second, fast enough to punch through armor plating. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited on contact burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A 2-second burst from one of these modified B-25s could shred the superstructure of a destroyer, destroy anti-aircraft guns, and kill exposed crews before they even returned fire. Pilots began to refer to the aircraft by a new nickname, the strafer. For comparison, most Japanese destroyers carried no more than 6 deck-mounted 25mm guns. A single strafer could deliver more forward-facing firepower than an entire escort ship. At close range, its guns didn't just damage targets, they carved through steel like a saw blade. One American mechanic described the sound during tests. It wasn't gunfire anymore. It was a mechanical scream. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, visited Eagle Farm to witness the new weapon himself. After the demonstration, he reportedly turned to his aide and said, "We'll make 100 of these if we can. They'll tear Japan's lifeline to pieces." Guns improvisation received official approval. North American Aviation began integrating the 8-gun modification into new production models. But for now, the field conversions would fight first. The newly formed 3rd Attack Group, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, would fly them. In early 1943, gunstrafer bombers were ready for combat. Their aluminum skins bore hand-painted names. Ruthless, dirty Dora-Hell's Angel. Each one carried not just guns, but a new philosophy. The pilots trained low, flying just above the treetops, learning to skim wave crests and attack from the horizon. They were told, "Get close enough to see the whites of their eyes." It wasn't just bravado, it was survival. At that height, a single mistake meant death, but success meant annihilating the enemy before he could react. What began as one man's field experiment was about to unleash mechanical terror on the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had no idea that its trusted convoy routes were about to become slaughter zones. If you think this kind of battlefield innovation could only happen in Wart-type genius in the comments. If you believe luck mattered more than invention, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter reveals how these flying monsters learned to skip bombs across the sea. As the newly modified B-25 Strafer gunships rolled out of the Australian workshops, a second innovation was taking shape just a few hundred miles away. It didn't involve more guns or new engines, but a daring new way to use the oldest weapon in the airmen's arsenal, the bomb. The man behind it was Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group, a quiet, methodical officer who had grown tired of watching high-altitude bombing runs miss every moving ship they aimed at. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too unpredictable, and Japanese captains were simply too skilled at maneuvering out of the way. Ben's idea sounded almost foolish the first time he described it. What if he said during a briefing at Port Moresby, "We make the bomb skip"? The idea came from watching children throw flat stones across a river. Ben realized that at just the right height and speed, a bomb could do the same bounce once or twice on the surface of the water, then slam into the side of a ship at waterline level. It was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. The aircraft would have to fly straight and level at an altitude no higher than 200 ft, sometimes even lower. At that height, one burst of anti-aircraft fire could tear the bomber apart. The release timing had to be perfect. Half a second too early, and the bomb would skip over the target. Half a second too late, and it would ricochet straight back into the plane. To test his theory, Ben's crews used a wrecked cargo ship stranded on a reef near Port Moresby, the SS Pruth, its rusted hull half submerged in the turquoise shallows. Day after day, pilots of the 43rd practiced attack runs. They flew so low that their propellers threw white spray off the waves. Navigators counted down the seconds to release while bombarders now retrained as spotters shouted, "Corrections!" over the intercom. The first attempts were disastrous. Bombs skipped wildly, exploded too soon, or missed entirely. But gradually, the men learned the rhythm of it, the glide, the release, the lift of the nose just before the explosion. One pilot compared it to throwing a rock so hard the sea itself jumps. Another said, "You could feel the air compress against the surface you were racing your own bomb." Ben recorded every run, adjusting for speed, angle, and altitude. He discovered that 250 ft of altitude, a speed of 220 km, and a release distance of about 600 yd gave the most reliable results. Fitted with 500 lb demolition bombs armed with 4 or 5 second delay fuses, the weapon would punch through a ship's hull before detonating inside. The crews who mastered skip bombing knew exactly how thin the margin of life was. Flying at mast height meant they could see the faces of men on deck. At that range, even a single hit from a 25mm gun could shred an engine or kill a pilot. Every training mission felt like combat, and every mistake ended with wreckage scattered along the reef. Yet the results were undeniable. After weeks of practice, the pilots of the 43rd Bombardment Group could hit a stationary ship 9 times out of 10. Moving targets would be harder, but not impossible. In January 1943, Ben's commanding officer invited General George Kenney to watch a live demonstration. As the B-25 came in low over the water, Kenney could see its reflection racing just below the fuselage. At precisely 600 yards, the bomb dropped, hit the surface, skipped once, and struck the hulk of the proof. A moment later, the wreck exploded in a geyser of flame and seawater. Kenney stared for a long time before turning to Ben. That, he said, is how we're going to end Japan shipping. The 5th Air Force began combining gun strafers with Ben's skip bombers. The plan was elegant and brutal. The strafers would go in first, unleashing 850 caliber guns to silence anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close that the explosions would lift ships out of the water. The Japanese defenses designed to track high-altitude or torpedo attacks would be useless against this 2-stage assault. The crews trained relentlessly. They learned to fly in tight formation at 50 ft to approach from the sun or from the direction of the wind to synchronize gunfire and bomb release so precisely that the entire attack lasted less than a minute. At dawn and dusk, the area strips at Port Moresby thundered with engines as pilots practiced until the horizon blurred. Mechanics painted shark mouths and nicknames on the noses of the aircraft, ruthless little hellion Barbie through. Third, each represented not just a bomber, but a promise that the next convoy to sail under the rising sun would not survive the encounter. By late February 1943, intelligence reports confirmed what they had been waiting for. A Japanese convoy, 8 transports and 8 destroyers was moving toward Lae to reinforce New Guinea. To the Japanese, it was a routine resupply mission. To the Americans and Australians, it was the perfect test of everything they had built in secret, the strafer gunships and the skip bombing doctrine that defied logic. At Eagle Farm and Port Moresby, armorers checked fuses and loaded belts of ammunition. Pilots studied maps of the Bismarck Sea, tracing attack routes with grease pencils. The air smelled of gasoline and wet soil. Men slept beside their planes, afraid to miss the call. For most of them, it would be their first low-level combat. For some, it would be their last. But they understood what was at stake. If the attack succeeded, it would Japan's ability to move troops across the Pacific. If it failed, thousands of Japanese soldiers would land safely at Lae, and the bloody campaign for New Guinea would continue. In the early hours of March 3rd, Ben's crews climbed aboard their B-25s. They strapped themselves in, tightened their harnesses, and waited for the engines to roar. The sun was still below the horizon, and a faint drizzle swept across the field. Someone shouted a prayer. The propellers spun, kicking dust into the air. The smell of fuel mixed with sweat. One by one, the bombers lifted into the darkness, their navigation lights blinking over the jungle canopy. Far to the north, the convoy they were hunting had no idea what was coming. The Japanese officers on watch would soon see tiny black dots on the horizon, skimming the waves like seabirds. The first sign that the laws of warfare were about to change forever. If you think you could have flown that low under enemy fire, type 2 in the comments. If you believe no man should ever have to hit, like and make sure to subscribe, because in the next part, the sky over the Bismarck Sea erupts into flame as the Americans strike. At precisely 1000 a.m., the lookouts aboard Admiral Kimura's flagship Shirayuki spotted silver flashes high above the horizon. The men shaded their eyes against the morning glare and pointed skyward. A formation of American bombers B-17E approached at roughly 700 ft. Kimura lowered his binoculars and nodded calmly. This was expected. For months, American high-altitude bombers had attacked Japanese convoys with little success. Their bombs fell harmlessly into the sea, sometimes close enough to send up columns of spray, but never close enough to hit. "Maintain course," Kimura ordered. The air defense officers moved into action, shouting range and bearing coordinates. Every destroyer in the convoy elevated its guns toward the approaching aircraft. The Japanese had practiced this hundreds of times. Anti-aircraft gunners loaded belts of ammunition, adjusting sights for altitude and wind. In minutes, the sky above the convoy filled with black bursts of flak. The thunder of 25mm cannons rolled across the sea like distant drums. But as the crews focused upward, no one saw what was coming in low. Barely 15 miles away, skimming just above the ocean, 12 Bounty-5 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group and 13 Royal Australian Air Force BU fighters were racing in at wavetop height. Their propellers churned up mist behind them. The sunlight flashed off their aluminum fuselages, each nose bristling with 8 machine guns. Major Edward Ed Liner, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, led the first attack. His aircraft bore the name Ruthless painted in black across the nose. Through his windshield, he could already see the columns of water rising from the B-17 bombs exploding far above. The Japanese gunners were doing exactly what he hoped. They were looking in the wrong direction. At 200 meters, Ruthless roared toward the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki. From the bridge, sailors suddenly noticed something glinting on the horizon. At first, they thought it might be low-flying reconnaissance planes. Then someone shouted, "Techie low!" The cry rippled across the deck. Gunners scrambled to swing their weapons downward, but the planes were already too close. Liner pressed the trigger. 850 caliber guns erupted at once. The entire nose of Ruthless exploded in flame and thunder. To the Japanese crew, it was as if a wall of light had appeared out of nowhere, tearing through steel and flesh alike. The first stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck Shirayuki's bridge at 2,900 ft per second. The window shattered, spraying glass across the command deck. Metal plates buckled. Men vanished in bursts of sparks and smoke. Within seconds, every gun crew exposed on deck was hit. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors, later recalled, "It was like being trapped inside a machine shop. As every wall caught fire, the air itself screamed." Liner held his trigger for 8 full seconds, firing nearly 900 rounds before releasing 2 500 lb bombs fitted with 5-second delay fuses. The bomb skipped once, twice, then struck the destroyer just below the waterline. The explosions blew Shirayuki's midsection apart. Steam and smoke burst upward as the ship began to list to port. Behind Ruthless, 11 more B-25s came in one after another, each selecting a new target. Lieutenant John Henterberry, flying the aircraft nicknamed the Hare, aimed for the transport Kikusai Maru. His 8 guns walked a line of fire from the bow to the stern, shredding the bridge and silencing every anti-aircraft position before his bombs hit. The ship's captain never had a chance to give orders. The helm was gone, his crew either dead or wounded. The MU fighters followed close behind, flying even lower, some barely 20 ft above the surface. Their 420mm cannons and 6 machine guns hammered the upper decks of the transports, cutting down any gunners who still tried to return fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of No. 30 Squadron RAAF later described it. "You could see the men on deck, their guns flashing. Then our cannons hit, and it was like watching the deck disintegrate. One moment there were shapes, the next there was just smoke and splinters." The air over the convoy turned into chaos. Ships wove in desperate maneuvers, throwing up plumes of white foam. The water boiled with tracer fire. Explosions echoed across the sea as bombs skipped across the waves, striking hulls and detonating deep inside. The Tamaru took a direct hit near the engine room, flames pouring from her ventilation shafts. The Nojima Maru was struck by 2 bombs that ripped her open like a tin can. On the destroyer, Arashio commander Koshi Sugino tried to shield the transports by steering between them and the attackers. His courage only made him a better target. 3 B-25s turned their fire on him simultaneously, unleashing a combined storm of 24 machine guns. The Arashio's bridge vanished in an eruption of fire and debris, its rudder jammed hard to starboard. Moments later, the OFC control destroyer collided with the transport Noima Maru. Both ships locked together, burning furiously as ammunition and fuel ignited. For the Japanese sailors who survived the first wave, it was as if the laws of war had been rewritten in front of them. There were no warning sirens, no altitude calls, no evasive maneuvers that worked. The attackers came too fast and too low to track. The sound of the B-25's guns, 8 barrels hammering in unison, was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't the staccato chatter of normal machine guns, but a continuous roar, a mechanical scream that shook the air. Admiral Kimura stood on the deck of his flagship and stared at the destruction. In every direction, ships were burning. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. The Kembu Maru, his largest transport, had taken 2 hits and was sinking stern first. Men were jumping overboard, their uniforms on fire. The sea, once calm and blue, was now stir with oil and flame. From above, Leonard's gunner watched the scene unfold through the rear turret. It was like hell had opened on the ocean, he said later. Everywhere you looked, something was exploding. The entire attack lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, climbing low over the burning wreckage, 4 Japanese destroyers and all 8 transports were either sinking or aflame. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were struggling in the water. The survivors could still hear the echo of the guns fading into the distance like thunder rolling away from a storm that had already passed. One Japanese officer standing waist-deep in the sea beside his overturned lifeboat watched a transport explode nearby and whispered, "We never saw them coming." If you believe this was the moment Japan's naval power began to break Type 3 in the comments. If you think they still had a chance to recover, hit like and remember to subscribe, because what happened next would show the true cost of 15 minutes in hell. When the last American bombers disappeared over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the crackle of burning oil and the distant cries of drowning men. Admiral Masashi Kimura remained on the bridge of his flagship, staring through a haze of smoke at what had once been his convoy. It had taken only 15 minutes. 15 minutes to turn 8 transports and 8 destroyers, Japan's lifeline to New Guinea, into a floating graveyard. The sea that had been calm and bright that morning was now black with fuel and debris shimmering under the orange light of flames. The flagship Shirayuki, once the pride of his escort line, was gone. Only a patch of burning oil marked where she had been. The destroyer Arashio was dead in the water, locked against the side of the transport, Nojima Maru. Both vessels burned from bow to stern ammunition, cooking off in bursts that sounded like fireworks. Men leaped into the sea to escape the heat, their uniforms catching fire as they hit the surface. Others clung to floating wreckage, faces slick with oil, screaming for help that would never come. Kimura gave orders to organize rescue operations, but the surviving destroyers were themselves damaged and on fire. The Asagumo tried to maneuver closer to pick up survivors, but within minutes, it was attacked by another wave of B-25 returning to strafe the wreckage. The low-flying gunship swept the decks clean with gunfire, killing crewmen as they tried to haul their comrades aboard. Even men who had already jumped into the water found no mercy. The Americans, following orders to prevent any reinforcement from reaching, strafed lifeboats and swimmers alike. For the Japanese sailors, there was no direction to run. The air stank of burning fuel and cordite. The sea boiled where oil caught fire. One survivor later described the horror. The water itself was burning. The heat came up from below, and the sky was red above. There was nowhere left to look that wasn't on fire. In the transport Kikus Maru, hundreds of soldiers from the 51st Division had been trapped below decks when the first bombs hit. As the ship sank, they tried to climb toward the hatches, only to find them jammed shut by twisted metal. Others jumped from portholes into the burning sea, their rifles and helmets dragging them under. Some made it to the surface, only to be sucked down again by the vacuum of sinking hulls. In the chaos, discipline and rank dissolved. Men shouted for mothers, for gods, for air. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few officers to survive later, wrote, "I heard men calling to each other, but the voices stopped one by one. A hand reached for me from the water, but when I grasped it, it came away at the wrist. I cannot forget the weight of that hand." By 10:30 a.m., less than half an hour after the first bombs had fallen, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The burning ships drifted aimlessly, colliding with one another as flames devoured their wooden decks. Explosions erupted at random as munitions and fuel tanks ignited. Every blast sent shock waves rippling across the oil-covered water, flipping bodies and lifeboats alike. Overhead, the smoke rose in pillars so thick that American reconnaissance aircraft could see them from over 50 men-hours away. Kimura's surviving destroyers, Asashio Yokocha's Shikami and Uranami, tried to regroup. They threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard anyone still alive. The decks were slick with blood and oil. Corpsmen worked without morphine or bandages, tearing their own shirts into strips. The wounded were laid in rows on the steel decks, some still clutching letters that had survived the fire, others whispering prayers to ancestors whose names they could barely remember. In the water, sharks had begun to gather. At first, they fed on floating debris and fish drawn by the carnage. Then, they began to take men. Survivors described the sea erupting around them as fins sliced through the oil, screams cut short as men vanished beneath the waves. For those left floating, it became a choice between burning and drowning. Many chose the latter. By early afternoon, the attack was over, but the suffering continued. The burning hulks of the transport smoldered through the day and into the night. The ocean glowed faintly from the fires, still burning on the surface, a red and orange reflection that flickered like a dying sun. The sky filled with smoke that drifted for miles, visible even from the airfields at Leia. American pilots circling back to assess the damage could hardly believe what they saw. Major Edward Liner wrote in his logbook, "We didn't need to count ships. You could see them sinking one by one. It looked like the end of the world." By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul, fewer than 1 to 200 would ever see land again. The rest, nearly 5,700 men, were dead or missing. Many still trapped inside their ships, entombed in the cold darkness below. When Japanese submarines arrived after dark to search for survivors, they found a sea of floating corpses and wreckage. The smell of fuel and death hung heavy in the air. The submarine's crews worked in silence, pulling aboard the few men still alive, their eyes wide and blank. The radio reports they sent back to Rabaul were short and staggering: convoy destroyed. Total loss. Survivors minimal. Admiral Kimura never recovered from what he saw that day. In his after-action report written weeks later, he could not bring himself to describe the battle in tactical terms. Instead, he wrote only one line: "The sea itself was our enemy." At dawn the next morning, as smoke still drifted across the water, a few sailors on the damaged destroyer Yukikaze gathered on deck to pray. One of them, a young seaman named Hiroshi Nakata, placed a folded paper crane into the sea. It floated for a moment, then caught fire as it touched an oil slick. He watched it burn until it was gone. War had never seemed so absolute, so mechanical, so final. In 15 minutes, a single innovation, 8 machine guns, and a new way to drop bombs had wiped out an entire Japanese division and crippled the Navy's faith in its own invincibility. The Pacific would never look the same again. If you believe war always destroys more than it ever wins, type W in the comments. If you think human invention inevitably leads to tragedy, hit like. And remember to subscribe, because the aftermath of this battle would change Japan's entire naval strategy and the world's understanding of modern warfare. When the first fragments of news from the Bismarck Sea reached Rabaul, disbelief turned to silence. Officers gathered around the decoded radio message, reading it twice to be certain it was real. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost thousands dead. Admiral Kimura among the survivors, but wounded mission failed. The scale of destruction was unthinkable. Never in the Imperial Navy's history had an entire convoy been wiped out in a single daylight attack. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of everything Japanese naval doctrine believed to be true. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report in his private office at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Those present later recalled that he read it slowly without expression, then placed the papers down and said quietly, "If this is true, then we no longer control the sea." For the commander who had once orchestrated the triumph at Pearl Harbor, it was a sentence heavier than defeat itself. The empire he had helped build now faced an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time without warning. Until that moment, Japan's surface fleet had relied on speed, discipline, and firepower. Convoys were protected by layers of destroyers, their anti-aircraft guns forming what they called the umbrella of steel. It had worked for nearly 2 years, but the Bismarck Sea shattered that illusion. No umbrella could stop bombs that skipped like stones or machine guns that cut through armor faster than human reflexes could respond. Within days, the Navy's operational planners convened an emergency meeting at Rabaul. Charts and maps covered the tables. Red circles drawn to mark the range of American aircraft from bases in Australia and New Guinea. The conclusion was immediate and devastating. Every major convoy route in the South Pacific now lay within reach of B-25 strafers and their escorting fighters. Moving supplies by day was suicide. Even heavily armed destroyers were powerless against aircraft that attacked at wave height and could strike from beyond radar range. The new order was clear: surface resupply would henceforth take place only at night. Troop transports were abandoned. Smaller vessels, barges, and submarines would attempt to carry food, ammunition, and fuel in secret, slipping through the darkness. The Japanese called it Yasen Yuso, the night run. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. But whatever the name, it was a desperate improvisation, and it could never replace the massive convoys that once carried entire divisions across the Pacific. The consequences spread far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Without steady resupply, the Japanese garrisons on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands began to wither. Soldiers who had once fought with discipline and confidence now starved in the jungle. Malaria, hunger, and exhaustion claimed more lives than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships. It was the death of logistics, the end of mobility. Statisticians within the Imperial Navy compiled the numbers, each line another wound. Between March 1943 and the end of 1944, Japan lost over 60% of its merchant fleet. Nearly 500 vessels were sunk: transport tankers, freighters, and destroyers. Many fell to the same combination that had destroyed Kimura's convoy. Low-level strafing attacks and skip-bombing runs by B-25s and their variants. What had once been a proud merchant marine became a list of names and hull numbers lost to history. Reports from survivors filtered back in the following weeks. Commanders described panic among their crews and almost superstitious fear of American aircraft. Sailors began referring to the B-25 as Hachimi no, on the eight-eyed demon, for the 8 gun barrels that glared from its nose. Others called it the flying saw, claiming that the sound of its guns could slice through the air itself. Even experienced officers admitted that their men froze at the first sight of the bombers coming in low, their courage drowned by memories of the firestorm that had consumed their comrades. At the Naval Staff College in Tokyo, analysts struggled to understand what had gone wrong. One report concluded bluntly, "Our doctrine assumes the enemy will attack as we would. He does not." For centuries, Japan's military philosophy had valued discipline, hierarchy, and repetition virtues that had served well in battles of precision and control. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced improvisation. They changed tactics overnight, turned bombers into gunships, mechanics into engineers, and experiments into victories. It was, Yamamoto admitted privately, the purest expression of industrial warfare, the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. For the Americans, the victory confirmed that the future of naval war no longer belonged to battleships or torpedoes. It belonged to machines like the B-25, fast, flexible, and deadly, and to the men who dared to reimagine how they were used. The 5th Air Force now had a weapon that could destroy entire convoys in minutes, a weapon that required neither fleet nor formation, only courage and ingenuity. In the months that followed, similar attacks became routine. Japanese convoys that attempted to run supplies to New Guinea, New Britain, or the Solomons were torn apart by Allied aircraft. Reports from surviving crews told the same story again and again: sudden appearance, blinding flashes, unending gunfire, and ships exploding within seconds. No amount of bravery or training could offset the speed and precision of the American onslaught. By late 1943, Admiral Yamamoto's fleet had been forced into a defensive crouch. Large-scale surface movements ceased almost entirely. The Imperial Navy, once master of the Pacific, had become a fleet of ghosts, hiding by day, moving only at night. Yamamoto's private diaries, recovered after the war, contained a line written shortly after the disaster. "It is not courage we lack. It is time. The enemy learns faster than we can think." In the United States, newspapers barely mentioned the battle. To the home front, It was one small victory in a distant ocean, but among pilots and mechanics, the Bismarck Sea became legend. It proved that improvisation could triumph over doctrine, that a handful of men in a makeshift workshop could alter the course of the war. Poppy Gun's creation had turned from an experiment into a symbol of American ingenuity, the embodiment of an industrial giant's ability to think on its feet. The psychological divide between the two sides widened with every sinking. For Japanese sailors, each voyage became a prayer. For American air crews, it became a test of precision and nerve. The Pacific itself seemed to change character, no longer an open battlefield, but a place where one side hunted and the other hid. The old rules of naval warfare, range, tonnage, formation, gunnery no longer applied. A new law had been written in the smoke of the Bismarck Sea. Whoever could combine innovation with speed would rule the oceans. By early 1944, Japanese commanders no longer planned operations based on courage or numbers, but on absence where the Americans were not. Convoys sailed under moonless skies, hugging coastlines, their lights extinguished. Yet even then, radar-equipped Allied aircraft often found them. The destruction continued. What had begun as a single battle had become a permanent reality. The day after receiving the report, Yamamoto called his staff together. "We have been defeated not by their weapons," he said, "but by their minds." It was in its simplicity the truth. The empire that had stunned the world with the brilliance of Pearl Harbor was now being undone by the same innovation it had once claimed as its own. The war was no longer about who could build the biggest ship, but who could change the fastest. The Bismarck Sea had proven that the age of the battleship was over. In its place stood a new kind of warfare, industrial, inventive, relentless. The Americans would carry that lesson forward, turning their factories into arsenals and their ideas into weapons. And for Japan, the once proud master of the Pacific, the sea that had once carried its conquests, had become a prison of oil fire and memory. Years later, when the war had ended and the wrecks of the Bismarck Sea had settled beneath layers of coral and silt, veterans from both sides would speak of that day with the same uneasy reverence. For the Americans, it was a moment of triumph, proof that creativity and mechanical genius could overcome doctrine and discipline. For the Japanese, it was the day when courage and tradition were swallowed by a new kind of warfare. Yet for everyone who had seen it, one truth remained. Nothing in war would ever be the same again. The B-25 Strafer had begun as an act of desperation, a field modification born in a dusty hangar by men working with salvaged parts and half-formed ideas. But its success had revealed a truth deeper than any single victory in industrial war. Invention itself was a weapon. The 8 gun barrels that jutted from the Mitchell's nose symbolized not just power, but the ability to adapt, to turn necessity into advantage. It was this mindset, not simply firepower, that came to define the American way of war. After the Bismarck Sea, the idea spread. North American aviation began producing factory-built versions of guns modifications. Later variants of the B-25, especially the J-22 model, carried up to 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. A flying arsenal capable of leveling small towns or obliterating convoys. Pilots began to view the aircraft not as bombers, but as hunters. When the 345th Bombardment Group, the Apaches, received their new strafers, they painted shark mouths across the noses and called them flying battleships. The Pacific skies became their hunting ground. By late 1943, the B-25 Strafer had redefined Allied air tactics. Squadrons developed new methods for attacking ships, airfields, even coastal defenses. At dawn, raids over Raal and Wewak, entire harbors vanished in minutes. Japanese observers described the sound of the approaching aircraft as a rolling drum fire that devoured the air itself. To those on the receiving end, it no longer felt like being attacked by planes, but by a moving factory of destruction, a symbol of America's industrial might made airborne. And yet among those who flew them, there was little celebration. The pilots and gunners who returned from missions carried the weight of what they had seen. Ships exploding, men leaping into fire, the sea turning red. Major Edward Liner, who had led the first wave over the Bismarck Sea, later admitted, "We didn't cheer when we landed. We just sat there. It felt like we'd seen too much." In his later years, he would visit museums where B-25s hung silent in perfect restoration, their polished aluminum skins gleaming under lights. "They don't make a sound anymore," he said, "but I still hear it." For Japan, the legacy was equally haunting. The B-25's victory forced the Imperial Navy into a shadow war of secrecy and survival. The convoys that once sailed under the sun now crept through moonless nights, moving silently through waters they once ruled. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea became a lesson written into every naval cadet's education. After the war, underestimate innovation, tradition becomes a liability. In the post-war years, military engineers across the world studied the concept that Poppy Gun had pioneered. An aircraft transformed into a gun platform capable of concentrating overwhelming fire on a single target. The idea resurfaced 2 decades later in the jungles of Vietnam. There, the U.S. Air Force resurrected the principle in the AC-47 Spooky gunship, arming a transport plane with side-firing miniguns that rained death in glowing arcs across the dark canopy. Its successor, the AC-130 Spectre, carried even greater firepower cannons, autoc cannon sensors, all echoing the same innovation born at Eagle Farm. And further still, in the late 20th century, the lineage of the Strafer could be seen in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Like its ancestor, it was ugly, durable, and devastating. Its GAU-08 Avenger cannon, firing 3 900 rounds per minute, was the modern equivalent of the B-25's 8 guns. The same principle endured an aircraft designed not just to deliver weapons, but to become one. Historians have often called the B-25 Strafer the most successful field modification in aviation history. But to those who built and flew them, success was never the word they used. They called it a survival. For every innovation that changed the course of war, there was a human cost that could not be measured in statistics. The wrecks of Shirayuki, Nojima Maru, and Kawusi Maru still lie scattered across the seabed, twisted and silent. Inside some of them, the remains of soldiers still rest, their names long forgotten. In 1969, divers from Papua New Guinea discovered one of the wrecks, a transport split cleanly in half. Its steel hull pierced in dozens of places by what looked like saw cuts. They thought at first it had been torn apart by explosives, but closer examination revealed hundreds of neat circular holes, each one the exact diameter of a .050 caliber bullet. Even after decades underwater, the evidence of what had happened remained. Today, the sea over those wrecks is calm again. Schools of fish drift through rusted corridors where soldiers once stood. Coral grows over the twisted steel, softening the outlines of destruction. Above, sunlight filters through the water in golden shafts, touching the guns, the railings, and the bones of ships long gone. The surface of the Bismarck Sea is smooth, but beneath it lie the traces of innovation and tragedy intertwined. It is tempting to call the B-25 Strafer a triumph of American ingenuity, and in a sense it was. It proved that courage and creativity could reshape the battlefield, that the workshop could be as decisive as the front line. But to those who watched entire convoys vanish beneath the sea, the memory carried another lesson, that every leap in invention also deepens the abyss of destruction. Major Poppy Gun never lived to see the full impact of his creation. He died in 1957 in a plane crash near the Philippines. On his desk at home, they found a note written in his hand. "We built them fast because men were dying faster." For him, and for so many others, the line between necessity and genius had always been thin. Standing today on the shores of Papua New Guinea, one can still look out over the Bismarck Sea and imagine that morning in 1943, the calm, the smoke, the thunder, and the silence that followed. Somewhere below, among the coral and sand, lie the remains of ships and men who witnessed the moment when war itself changed form. The 8 gun barrels that once jutted from the noses of American bombers now rest in museums and memorials, their metal dulled by time, but they remain symbols of a truth that transcends nations and victories. In war, the tools that define progress often carry the weight of what they destroy. And as the waves roll gently over the graves of March 3, 1943, the sea keeps its secret, a quiet monument to ingenuity, to devastation, and to the fragile boundary between